Welcome. Welcome to the 4th International Apologetics Marathon. This is the third night of the 2-week marathon, and we have a lot of great topics and special guest speakers coming up during these next 2 weeks, or week and a half now. My name is Dr. Daniel Janosik, and I am a teacher at Southern Evangelical Seminary, which is in Charlotte, or Matthews, North Carolina. I teach apologetics, I teach Islamic studies, and I have taught biology in the past. So I'm greatly looking forward to this topic that we're dealing with tonight. And the topic that we have chosen is created or evolved. So the whole idea of whether this world was created, man was created, all that we have around us was created. So this is what we want to discuss, and we have two special guests tonight. We have Dr. Jean Lightner, who I will introduce in a moment, and we also have Dr. Kevin Anderson. Now, Dr. Jean Lightner has studied animals a lot. She studied animal science and veterinary medicine at The Ohio State University. She received a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture in 1979, a doctorate in veterinary medicine in 1985. So she knows her animals, and she also obtained a Master of Science in Veterinary Preventative Medicine in 1987. And it's interesting that since high school, she has had a strong interest in creation evolution as a topic, and especially because she recognized the importance of believing the Bible to live a consistent Christian life. And that's when there was a lot of flack in the school system for Christians who believed in science and the Bible. So it'll be interesting to hear from Dr. Lightner in regard to this. Now, she is currently an instructor, an adjunct instructor with Liberty University Online, and they are the largest Christian school in the world with over 80,000 online students. So they have a real good online program going for them. And I also need to plug the program at Southern Evangelical Seminary because we have a good online program there, especially for apologetics. I think it's the best apologetics program in the nation. Well, she also serves as a board member with the Creation Research Society, CRS, and it's an organization that averages over 600 voting members who have advanced science degrees, and they hold to a young earth view of creation. So there are a number of scientists in this area who are well credentialed, and they all hold to this idea of a young earth. And CRS also has many more lay members who help support this research, and they put together a number of journals, and we'll talk about that when we mention Dr. Kevin Anderson. So, Dr. Lightner, it's good to have you on the program tonight.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here.
Great. And did you want to add anything to the biographical information there that would help people understand where you're coming from? Could you add to that, please?
Well, that covers most of it. I have an interest in animals, and in the Bible, it says that God created animals according to their kinds. It seems true of plants, but I'm interested in the animals.
Okay.
And so one of the questions I have is, how have animals reproduced and filled the earth like God said? And so I did some estimates about how many animals would need to be on the ark and things like that. So those are some of my interests.
What was the number that you came up with?
I don't remember specifically. I did mammals and birds, and we were in the hundreds. And for some of them, we didn't have fossil organisms for all of them. But there's a few thousand kinds that would need to be on the ark, and you double it because each one has a mate. It's not that hard to fit them on. It was a huge boat, and so it's very realistic.
Yeah, we'll have to get into that as we get on with the show a little bit. I know that when I was teaching that area in my class, I was using the John Morris material from Institute of Creation Research, and they put the number at about 17,500. So with 2 for each of those kinds, you have about 35,000 of the animals and major genus, I guess. So we'll get into that. That'll be a very good topic to pick up on a little bit later. Now we also have Dr. Kevin Anderson, and he holds a PhD in microbiology. Yay, one of my favorite areas. That was one of the topics that I enjoyed the most when I taught biology. He was an NIH postdoctoral fellow. That's the National Institute of Health. And since then, he has served as a university professor, a USDA research scientist, and director of laboratory research for a biotech company. Now, he is currently the director of the Van Andel Creation Research Center and is past senior editor of the Creation Research Society Quarterly, a journal that I often had my students read when they were doing their papers and their weekly reports. So we got a lot of use out of that. Great articles. He has published numerous technical research articles and has presented at both national and international science meetings. So welcome, Dr. Kevin Anderson. Could you add a little bit to your bio that I gave there, please?
Well, I guess what I would add is that since majoring in microbiology, I have focused specifically in the area of molecular biology, particularly in genetics, the action of the DNA, the action of proteins with DNA, and then since the publication of the human genome data back in the turn of the century, why I've been spending a lot of time studying and understanding genetics of humans as well. So my background is certainly microbiology, cell biology. I still do bacterial work, but it mostly is focusing on DNA. It's focusing on genetics of bacteria and genetics of humans and some other organisms.
Excellent, because we've got some great questions that will probe you in that area, and we'll look forward to hearing what you have to say in that as well. Okay, so our topic is creation or created or evolved. So of course we're looking at the major differences. Dr. Lightner and then Dr. Anderson after that, how would you describe the general view of evolution? What's the major view that would be taught in the high schools and colleges in a synopsis form? What are we talking about when we talk about evolution?
Okay, basically all of life has a common ancestry, not separate created kinds, but everything goes back to the same common ancestor. And you have an awful lot of explaining to do that basically is done with storytelling. One of the things they do is use the word evolution very sloppily to try to make a point. So for example, God created different kinds of animals and told them to reproduce and fill the earth, and they do vary and they do change somewhat as they fill the earth. So you could look at finches on the Galapagos, for an example. And they vary a little bit in size and shape, and they can vary in color. And they say, aha, we see change over time. That proves evolution is true. So basically, because the size of the beak and other proportions on the body of the finch can vary, I'm supposed to believe that the finch and I share a common ancestor. And there's just a tremendous leap of logic there. And so they will give evidence for the types of changes that creationists fully accept because we see them. And then they will assume that the same processes can explain how human beings got eyes and all our internal organs from something that never had them.
Okay. Now, basically, we're talking about the difference between perhaps macroevolution and microevolution. Macroevolution being the large changes, species changing into very different creatures, the idea of dinosaurs evolving into the birds, and perhaps the ape-like creatures, not apes themselves, but ape-like creatures evolving into man today. That would be macroevolution. versus
Yeah.
microevolution. Do either of you want to distinguish that more? What's the difference between those two ideas?
I have a cautionary note on that. To a
Okay.
paleontologist, you just described macroevolution. It's big structural changes. The problem is in order to try to explain things and fit things in, biologists will use a different meaning for the word macroevolution. So if you get speciation, something becomes a different species, they call that macroevolution. And you sort of ask, well, okay, so what really changed? Well, it's different enough that it doesn't usually, in separate species, they don't usually mate with each other even when they're nearby. Sometimes they do, but not very often. And so you've got a different species, but nothing new. So you have to be cautious because biologists will use that term in a way, again, it's very sloppy. They're trying to shove everything in and take things we do see and try to make it look like it supports things we don't see. So be cautious with macroevolution, but you're right. It's those big, large structural changes that we don't accept because we've never seen them.
Let's go to Dr. Anderson for a moment, and could you fill us in a little bit more about the evolution narrative and this idea perhaps also of what you think of micro versus macro?
Well, I have in my office a number of biology textbooks, older, some newer. So this is going to these textbooks, I would say, represent really what is the trend, what is the history, if you will, of how evolution is taught at the college level. And in these textbooks, you're going to find that, as Dr. Lightner pointed out, they tend to want to define evolution as just simply change. If it changes, it's evolved. They don't worry about defining what kind of change it was. They don't worry about defining how the change occurred. It's just a change that occurred, therefore it evolved. Well, as a biologist, one thing that's kind of silly about that is because offspring are not clones of their parents in an animal world, and even in the plant world, as far as that goes, everything is certainly going to change simply because of that. And yet that would be identified as evolution by that very broad, what I would say, kind of catch-all definition. And so evolution has really lived within that world for a number of years that they don't have to defend very much because it's just change, and that's all they look for. But as Dr. Lightner alluded to, and as I would certainly emphasize, true evolution, as they're talking about, as is really being preached, is common descent, and in fact, universal common descent, that we and dogs and whales and oak trees all have a universal ancestor that we all came from. And that is far different than you're not the same as your parents, or this tree is not the same as this tree. That's a totally different situation. So again, as Dr. Lightner was pointing to, they take these very small changes and they then extrapolate and assume that these small changes, like the change in the coloring of a butterfly or the change in the shape of a bird beak, now suddenly gives you the ability of becoming a whale from some kind of four-legged ungulate on the land, or becoming a human from some kind of primate. And so they make a huge extrapolation based upon what they don't really have evidence for. And so that's what we see historically in these textbooks is they define evolution very broadly, and then they spend a lot of time talking about these minor changes, and then they pretend that, oh, and this demonstrates how we became humans. This demonstrates how life evolved. This demonstrates how trees evolved. And of course, the leap is immense, and yet they really make it seem like it's just a natural step.
Let me pick up on that for a moment and bring Dr. Lightner back in, because it's going to deal with a bird, the finches of the Galapagos Islands. I remember when I think it was Dr. Peter Grant in 1995 came out with a new book called The Beak of the Finch, and basically he had done yearly studies on the beaks of the finches of the Galapagos Islands, and those were the islands that Darwin visited and gradually came up with his particular ideas, interestingly enough, through his Christian classification expert who looked at these samples when he brought them back. But anyway, these finches have been cited as being evidence for evolution because of their changes. And so Dr. Grant went and studied these, and in 1995 he came out with a book and said this demonstrates evolution more than anything else. And yet, what did he really find with that, that study? Could you fill us in on that?
Yeah, actually, a lot of this will come from an even more recent book that they wrote. He and his wife studied there for years, and they found that within the medium ground finch, one of the types of finches on the island, that there was quite a bit of variability. You had your larger birds with larger beaks and your smaller birds with smaller beaks. The larger birds ate larger, harder seeds, and the smaller birds ate the smaller, softer seeds. And so what happened, I mean, he chose to study that because there was variability. And he was looking for natural selection to do something. And so, lo and behold, one year there was a drought, a severe drought. And basically the smaller seeds disappeared and the birds with smaller beaks died. Actually, even the larger seeds were kind of scarce, but it was preferentially hard on the smaller beak birds. And there was a change. There was like a 5% increase in the average beak size. Wow, that's evolution. Well, if you're going to define it loosely as just change, well, yeah, it's change, but you didn't get anything new. The other thing that's interesting is when natural selection was operating, it wasn't helping the birds become better adapted to their environment. It was killing them. It was killing the birds with the small beaks. And in the next year or so, when the rains came back, those seeds came back. But here you'd eliminated a portion of the population. And another drought came a number of years later. But the circumstances were different. The years before that drought were extremely wet. And those plants with the small seeds took over the island. So this time when the drought hit, you had the larger seeds that became depleted first. And so the birds with the larger beaks were dying of starvation. Natural selection at work. And yeah, it's natural selection at work. What is it doing? It's killing the birds. Okay, and you had the same type of thing with the other end of the spectrum. So you saw change. Yes, you saw change. And you saw natural selection killing the birds. It wasn't helping them adapt to their environment. But one of the things in the more recent book that comes out is there was something that brought variability back into that population. There were two other species that don't usually mate with the medium ground finch, but can mate with it, and they did. Just a few individuals would mate across the species lines, and it brought more variability back into the finches. So if anything, natural selection was busy killing the birds, but through hybridization, because they had speciated, because they usually were separate populations that did not interbreed, but they could interbreed a little bit, in that time of need, it brought needed variation back into the medium ground finch population, which helped their long-term survival. So you don't find natural selection that's supposed to be the hero of the plot being the hero with those finches. It's there, it's operating, it's definitely affecting them, but it's killing them, and it's not helping them adapt. But you see, God provided in other ways, like through this speciation process where you have separate populations that can sometimes interbreed, but don't usually. And it would restore some of what was lost. So it's really fascinating.
Okay. So if we extend that a little bit further out and pull this together, first of all, the idea there is that evolution, macroevolution, is saying that there would be these large changes. So over time, through speciation, they would diverge so much that they would no longer be able to mate, and they would make more and more changes or have more and more changes through natural selection or through mutations or macro mutations. And in time, there would be a very different type of creature and no longer what they were. So the whale series would be that idea of whales then evolving into the land creatures and so on, or vice versa. You have those very large changes. Dr. Anderson, I want to come back to you on this before we kind of bring this area to a convergence. You've done a lot with the genetics and the DNA. And this
Right.
is an area where the people with the Human Genome Project, for example, have said that there is such a small percentage of difference between, say, the chimps and the humans that this shows that we had to come from a lower creature or an ape-like creature. What is your take on this?
Yeah, the argument is that supposedly we're only 1.5% different in our genome versus the chimpanzee genome, and the chimpanzee being our closest evolutionary relative. We both supposedly evolved from some common ancestral primate some 5 to 6 million years ago. And so because there's only 1.5% difference, this demonstrates just how genetically similar we are, and supposedly then is proof of the idea that we, followed the same evolutionary path through most of Earth history. That argument, among other things, is really based on some very flawed analysis and certainly very flawed speculation. You have to understand how those kind of comparisons are made, and typically they're not made the way that the public's being led to believe that they're being made. You're not taking number one chromosome of the human and comparing it to number one chromosome of the chimpanzee, because if you do that, you get virtually no similarity at all. So the whole comparison that's being made is very much a shotgun type approach. It's an approach where they're taking just certain bits and pieces of the DNA of human and the DNA of chimpanzee and comparing them together. And so it really does not reflect what people are being led to believe that it reflects. It's very misleading in how it's done. Also, you have to recognize the chimpanzee has one more chromosome pair than the humans have. See, humans have 23 sets of chromosomes. Chimpanzees have 24 sets of chromosomes. So somewhere in there, either the chimpanzee gained a set of chromosomes or the humans lost a set of chromosomes. And that then brings in a whole nother issue of what happened and how that worked and such. And you don't hear a lot about that either. And there's very good evidence that chimpanzees have always had 24 and humans have always had 23, and it's very difficult for evolutionists anymore. They tried, but it's very difficult for them anymore to try to claim that humans lost some chromosomes. And so that's become quite a sticky point for them to explain the difference between why chimpanzees have 24 and we have 23. And there's all kinds of examples like that that just demonstrate that we're not nearly as genetically like chimpanzees as it's being proposed that we are. Now, you'd still expect some similarity, obviously, because we live on the same planet, we drink the same water, we breathe the same air, we have some of the same dietary considerations, we have a lot of the anatomical similarities. So you would certainly expect some similarities. That wouldn't be surprising. But is it where we're almost totally the same? See, that is not really holding water anymore. There's a lot of true genetic challenge to that. In fact, one of the supporters of the idea that the human and chimpanzee DNA is virtually the same several years ago now says, okay, well, I guess we really don't know anymore. We can't say, because he's recognized you can't really do the comparison like it's being done. It doesn't work. But the public keeps being told that it does, but it really doesn't.
Okay, good overview of that. I know Biologos, which is a group of Christians who believe in theistic evolution. In other words, God used macroevolution to bring about the speciation and the changes over time, do try to give some of these arguments that regular secular evolutionists would also use, such as the DNA evidence.
If you'll notice, regrettably, since you bring them up, you'll notice regrettably some of their articles in the last 5 years or so, 4 years, that have tried to make those arguments are very dated. They use sequential information such from 2001, 2003, 2004. They're not using anything from 2013, 2014, 2015. They're very antiquated, and in a sense they really embarrass themselves. They need to dramatically update those arguments because they just simply are out of date. And I would argue that they're not updating because they can't. To update, they have to abandon, because it's no longer, I would challenge, it's no longer legitimate to say that the human and chimpanzee are actually 1.5% different in their entire genomes. They're going to try to qualify, well, protein coding and this and that, but that's not what the public's being told. The public's being told 1.5% difference of the entire genome, and that they can't make that argument anymore, and they need to update.
I just, interestingly enough, I just heard from another Christian scientist, creationist, who deals with the genetic information. He said that with the Human Genome Project, which we thought was complete, that they had mapped out everything, there are whole sections that they have not really mapped out because they considered them repetitive or kind of junk DNA, as Francis Collins has even mentioned, and he was the leader of a part of this project.
Correct.
And,
so because of his evolutionary thinking about junk DNA, they didn't sequence, for many years, they didn't sequence portions of the human genome because it was considered irrelevant. And there's an example where evolution actually held science back.
Yeah. Well, this is probably, we're going to be bringing it to a break in just a couple minutes. So let's try to pull this together. We're trying to at least give an idea of how macroevolution, or what we typically hear of in the school, the narrative of evolution in the school system, is talking about a large trend in changes over everything. So you have the veritable idea of man coming from one-celled creatures all the way through the fish, all the way through the animals, the lemurs 50 million years ago, onward to the ape-like creatures, and then down to man either 1 million years ago, 2 million years ago. And it might be good to pick up on some of those ancestral finds of man in the next section. But the basic thing that we're looking at is trying to find out which one answers the questions best, which one has the evidence that really supports either creation or evolution. And in the next section, we'll look at that. Where is the evidence? What does it show? So we'll be back in a few minutes. Thank you for watching.
ABN and Trinity Channel would like to invite you to 2 special live debates, Shabir Ali versus David Wood. The first debate will be on Monday, September 28th, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 7 p.m. Greenwich, and 4 a.m. Australian Time. The topic will be,
was Jesus the Son of God or only the prophet of God?
The second debate will be on Tuesday, September 29th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 7 p.m. Greenwich, and 4 a.m. Australian Time. The topic will be, Paul or Muhammad, who gives us the truth about Jesus? Watch us live on ABN and Trinity Channel, or visit our website at trinitychannel.com or abnsat.com. For more information, call the numbers at your screen.
ABN and Trinity Channel invites you to watch a special live debate, Imam Ijazi Ahmed versus Dr. Tony Costa. The topic will be,
was Jesus the Son of God or only the prophet of God?
The debate will be held October 9th, 2015, 7 p.m. Eastern, 12 a.m. Greenwich, and 9 a.m. Australian. Watch us live on ABN and Trinity Channel, or visit our websites trinitychannel.com and abnsat.com. Or for more information, call us at one of the numbers on your screen.
David Wood with the Trinity Channel. After a terrorist attack, if you turn on CNN, what do you hear? Lies. After a suicide bombing, you turn on the BBC. What do you hear? Lies. What do you hear from Al Jazeera? What do you hear from the New York Times or politicians? Lies, lies, lies. I work with the Trinity Channel because this is one of the only networks in the world that's telling the truth about jihad and its origins. But we'd like to reach more people. We're already expanding into Europe and to countries around the world. But the equipment is outdated. In order to continue broadcasting, we invite you to support us by prayers, by sharing with your friends, by passing on the word of the programs, and if you can, financially. The money will be put to good use. I assure you, the people here work day and night bringing the truth around the world. So please partner with us and be sure to visit us at www.trinitychannel.com.
Welcome back to the Trinity Channel, and this evening we are dealing with a topic that is a very helpful one for us as Christians to deal with, and it is the question of whether we're created or whether we have evolved from lower creatures. We have two special guests with us tonight. First of all, my name is Dr. Daniel Janosik. I teach at Southern Evangelical Seminary. We have an apologetics program there that we would love to have you join up with us to go through, and it is fully online in many ways. So check us out when you can, ses.edu. Our two guests tonight are Dr. Jean Lightner, and she is a board member of the Creation Research Society, and she has been working with the topic of animals for a number of years, and she has her PhD in the area of veterinary medicine, and she teaches online for Liberty, one of our competitors, but that's okay. They have some very good programs there, and I'm glad you're teaching for them. So thank you for being here. And we also have Dr. Kevin Anderson, and he has a PhD in microbiology and has done postdoctoral work with the NIH and a lot of research, and he writes for the Creation Research Society quarterly. And I think he was even the past senior editor of that journal. So I thank you for your good work in these areas, both of you. It's been great to have you as part of the program. I want to pick up on what we were dealing with the first segment. And what we are trying to show is basically which side is supported by the evidence, creation or evolution. And so in this segment, we want to go into some of the evidence, some of the design, some of the things that can either support one or the other. But before we do that, there's a good question that we need to kind of probe for a moment. And Dr. Lightner, I will ask you first. How does the Bible affect your ability to do science? Do you think you're a better scientist because you have faith in the Bible, faith in the God of the Bible, or does it hold you back?
Actually, it provides the foundation for doing science. The Bible gives me a reason to want to study the world around me because God created it. He created human beings in His image to be able to take care of it, and I have to understand it to do that. And so it gives me strong motivation to study. The second thing is, it gives me a reason to believe that science should work. If you think about it, if we're just sort of evolved pond scum that just sort of happened to get here, why would we trust our minds? Why would we have the idea that there's such a thing as truth? How do you get truth without a God who has those characters and puts and brings those into creation? You don't have truth. You don't have a reason to expect that the way things behave today, they'll also behave that in a similar way tomorrow. You don't have a foundation for science without a biblical worldview, which is why that's where science flourished. So you don't even have a basis for science without the Bible. But there's another thing that's helpful, especially for the young earth creationists, is we take the Bible's history and we can use it to understand our world better. And I'd like to give an example, if I could, in genetics that doesn't just fit with creation, it fits with the Bible's narrative. And it has to do with mitochondrial DNA. Now, most of the DNA we're used to thinking of is in the nucleus of the cell. But there's these things in the cytoplasm called mitochondria. They make the energy so the cell works. And what happens is the cell that goes to the next generation comes from the mother. So this is always inherited through the mother, which is different. In the nucleus, half comes from the mother and half comes from the father. Well, there is a man named Dr. Robert Carter, who works for Creation Ministries International, who did some study on mitochondrial DNA in humans. And he found out there happened to be 3 lineages. Now, they're very similar, but there's 3 lineages. It fits great with the Bible because after the flood, you had Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Each had a wife, and those 3 lineages would be traced back to those 3 women. Okay, well, there's further study that can be done. Instead of assuming or trying to guess a rate of change in mitochondrial DNA, you can actually measure it. It doesn't happen very quickly, but it seems to be usually at a consistent pace. And if we actually measure the rate of change in mitochondrial DNA and we look at what we have in the world around us, we can calculate that human beings were created on the earth about 6,000 years ago. And that fits with the chronology in the Bible. If you take Genesis chapter 5 and chapter 11 and do some estimating, you would tend to estimate around 6,000 years for the age of the earth. And the mitochondrial DNA fits both the time that human beings were created, and it fits with the flood story, where there were 3 different wives that were basically the mothers, grandmothers, or whatever of the rest of us on the face of the earth. So it's really neat because the biblical history is valuable to a much deeper extent than just providing a basis for science.
Okay, we may come back to that mitochondrial issue. I'd like to go to Dr. Anderson and get his take on this. Dr. Anderson, how does the Bible affect your ability to do science? What does your faith have to do with the whole sphere? You spent so many years in the scientific field, and yet you are a man of faith. You're a believer. What does that do to you?
Well, kind of a little bit as Dr. Lightner was talking about, science is really biblically based, and that's something I would challenge everybody to think about. It's not coincidental that what we would identify as modern science came out of a culture that was a biblical culture. It didn't come out of cultures that were practicing Hinduism or Buddhism or spiritualism or Islam. It didn't come out of those cultures. It came out of the culture that was practicing, accepting, or at least preaching from the Bible. So science is biblically based because, as Dr. Lightner pointed out, the Bible gives us a framework that this universe is designed, it's structured, it has a certain symmetry to it, it has a certain predictability to it, and that's what science requires. If everything was always changing, gravity changed, chemical reactions changed, all those things changed, there'd be no way to do science because, because every day the results would be different from your experiment. And of course, one of the key things of science is that we have to be able to repeat what we're constantly experimentally demonstrating. That's how we know that it's correct and we didn't make an experimental error. But if it is that the chemistry is changing, the physics is changing, then there's no way to do science. But we know those don't change simply because we know that God set up in the created universe then the capability for all this to be ordered and structured. There's no reason to assume that if you don't assume that God created. There's no reason that a non-created universe should be orderly, should be non-chaotic, should be predictable. There's no reason at all for that. So really, the Bible and my Christian faith, I would say, not only makes me a better scientist, in essence, it's essential to be a scientist. That doesn't mean that people that aren't Christians don't practice science. That's not true at all. But they are cheating in that they're using biblical principles. They're using principles of creation to do their science. They're just denying that that's what they're doing.
That is an excellent point, and I wanted to bring up something here. The whole idea of science itself coming into its being, its use, and it's a very useful thing. The scientific method has really helped us develop our whole way of thinking through things logically, using reason. But as you mentioned, science itself, as we know it today, could not have arisen from any other culture or religion. The Hindus, because they think that reality is basically an illusion, would never have come up with science, even though they're very good with philosophy and abstract things and numbers. They would never have been able to come up with science. The Jews would have been closer because they have a very good understanding of the God from the Old Testament. They have a very orderly understanding of God and an appreciation for His creation. The Muslims tried. They dealt with science in what is called their golden age, but basically they were taking ideas that were already here, for example, with the number system and even algebra. They were borrowing that a lot from those conquered people like the Indians who developed a lot of that number system. We use Indian numbers, and we call them Arabic numbers, but they're really Indian numbers, for example. So it wasn't until we had the Renaissance, and really it was because of Christians before that that developed and started experimenting. Francis Bacon and others who developed this scientific method. And then we had the 18th, 17th, 18th, 19th century where Christians led the field in science because they believed in a God who created and created in an orderly fashion, and that we can think God's thoughts after Him by appreciating and learning what He has put together. Your comments on that, Dr. Lightner?
Yeah, I was under the impression of pretty much the same, that actually the Reformation, I think, was the way I understood it, was foundational for science then to be birthed. But it makes sense. And it was strange because even in 10th grade when I studied biology and they taught about evolution, because I went to public schools my whole life, I really didn't like evolution, because if that was true, then there was no reason to be a good student. There was no reason to study. It just sucked the meaning out of everything. Mm-hmm. It's like, zapping the life out of something. And it didn't make sense even when I was in 10th grade, because I understood that philosophically you can't support that worldview. If we just evolved, nothing matters. Why study? So, yeah, Christianity definitely provides a basis for wanting to study even.
Yeah. Back to you, Dr. Anderson, in that way, what would you say about this whole sense of Christianity bringing about science as we know it, and that it could not have been done through any other culture? You alluded to that. Can you say anything else about that?
Right. Well, I think it's already been discussed, but yes, we find that people that accept the God of the Bible, people that accept then the Christian teaching, you say the Jew can get a little close, but people that accept the Christian teaching, first off, do not identify the creation as the creator. Therefore, there's no blasphemy, for example, in studying the creation as some cultures might teach. But second off, because they recognize it as the creation from an orderly, wise creator, then there is going to be the understanding that there's going to be predictability. There's going to be capability of understanding this. It's going to be understandable. If you don't think the universe is understandable, what's the point of science? And so that's what drove, I would say, the early pioneers of science is their Christian understanding, their Christian basis, that this is going to be, we're going to be able to understand this. We see the Chinese thousands of years ago had some technological advancements. They had gunpowder and such, but that's not science. That's not the same thing. And people get that confused. And the reason they didn't study in a scientific approach is because of how they viewed the universe. They did not view it as something that could be understood.
Okay. This is very interesting. I want to use this as the basis for the next question. And back to Dr. Lightner. Start us off on this. Why is the Bible's account of creation more convincing than the evolutionary story? What would you look at?
There's a number of things. It explains details, obviously not exhaustively, but explains details of how creation was done that make sense. Creatures were created according to their kinds. They were told to reproduce and fill the earth. And you can find that in Genesis 1. And then there was this global flood. And then after the flood, they were to reproduce and fill the earth again. And you find that what we see is consistent with that. As they fill the earth, you do find some variations show up and they become different populations. And you find that, for example, the hares that are in the desert look different than hares that are in the Arctic and they look a little different from hairs in other parts of the world. And you see some adaptation going on, which makes sense because we have a God who provides for his creatures. So there's a reason why those adaptations take place. And yet, if you look at life on Earth, you don't see this big blur from one type of thing into another. And if you go look at the fossil record, you see these big discontinuities. There's these big gaps. And if evolution were true, you shouldn't have those big gaps. And the problem is with evolution, you don't have a creator that can design things. So you have all this design, and you've got no way to get it. And their explanation for design, random mutation and natural selection, doesn't make any sense. You don't take a nicely designed system, randomly do errors to it, and expect to end up with something better. That's ridiculous. That's not the way the world works. So the Bible's explanation makes logical, rational sense. The evolutionary one is very much like a fairy tale. It's very imaginative, but it's not consistent with reality.
Well, evolutionists would of course come back and say, well, wait a minute, evolution makes much better sense. I want to go to Dr. Anderson. I want to play the evolutionary part, and I'm going to therefore ask you, Dr. Anderson, why do you say that the biblical account is more of creation, is more convincing than the evidence that evolutionists give? What would you say to that?
Well, the biblical account would give us a account, if you a scenario where all of the development, all of the order, all the sophistication of biological systems is there immediately. And all of the basic diversification is there immediately. You have birds, you have land animals, you have insects, you have the marine creatures, you have all the basic diversity of biology immediately. You're not having one transition into another and try to explain how that happens. The problem with evolutionary teaching is what they're going to do is they're going to have everything start out very, very simple. They have to really start with a single cell, whatever they want to define that single cell as, and they struggle with that too, but they have to start with a single cell. Yeah. That single cell then becomes multiple cells, and multiple cell then becomes some kind of organism, some kind of very simple organism, which then eventually becomes like a sponge or some other kind of very early invertebrate, and then from that you're going to move up then into fish, and from that then you got to come onto land. And they're going to have this massive progression going, and they've got to have then occurring through all of this, you've got to have genetic development. You've got to have an organism that could not fly suddenly develop the genetic capability of being able to fly. An organism that could not swim suddenly having the genetic ability to be able to swim. And so all this is a very upward, onward process. So kind of to use from Richard Dawkins' analogy, climbing Mount Improbable. You're climbing this huge mountain a step at a time. The problem is evolution, even as he admits, evolution has a struggle doing that if you're trying to climb the face of the mountain, because it really can't do that. It's got to do it a different way. Whereas what creation would say is because we start out with all of this already in place, we're actually coming down the mountain. And so if we look at all the genetics, if we look at any example of a genetic change, any example of a genetic mutation, we don't see that they are steps that give us a mountain climbing capability. And this is a huge challenge to evolution. So I've had this challenge out there for years. Give me your actual genetic mechanism. Give me the examples that show how you're climbing this mountain a step at a time. What we see when we look at the mutations, what we see when we look at the adaptations, such as with the finches we talked about earlier, what we see is we're either moving parallel on the mountain or we're coming down off the mountain. But those are not genetic changes that are given the ability of moving up the mountain. And without a mechanism to move up the mountain, then evolution is really scientifically dead. They can offer any kind of scenario they want to the false record, any kind of scenario they want to every other little idea they want to talk about. But until they have an actual functional mechanism that moves them up the mountain, as they're claiming they're doing, see, then it's scientifically a dead idea. It's the same as if I have a murder scene where I'm saying, okay, the victim is in his apartment, the doors are all locked, and he has a gun by his side, but the gun is registered to his neighbor, therefore his neighbor did it. But of course, the simple fact of the matter is that the evidence shows the neighbor was actually in Tahiti at the time, but I'm still going to say the neighbor did it because it's his gun that committed the murder. See, they don't have a mechanism to explain how the neighbor committed the murder, but they still assume that they did that anyway. They don't have a mechanism to explain how evolution has occurred, but they assume it happened anyway. And to me, it's just as big a violation as if I was a forensic scientist and made that kind of leap. It defies what we know about the forensic science. It defies what we know about genetics, but they still make the leap anyway.
Okay, let's parse this a little bit because I think it's a very helpful point. When we think about the mechanisms, as you mentioned, the early mechanism right after Darwin was natural selection, survival of the fittest. And actually that's kind of what we call a tautology, a self-identifying definition. The fittest survive because they are the fittest. It doesn't tell us much information, but the idea of natural selection that with the finches, the stronger ones survived and the weaker ones died out, so the stronger ones were able to go ahead and propagate. And so we have those particular genetic...
As Dr. Lightner alluded to, all natural selection does is it's a culling mechanism. It just kills off populations. Natural selection cannot reach into the organism and say, okay, you need to become this. It can't do that. It just says, if you don't become this, you're going to die. But the organism itself has to have the ability of making the appropriate change. And as creationists, we argue that that programming came from the creator, but it's not the kind of change that evolutionists are pointing to. It does not give you the mechanism to show how a fish can become an amphibian, to have how a pig can become a whale. It doesn't give you those kind of mechanisms, and yet that's what evolution has to have, and they don't. And therefore, to me, it's a dead science.
And actually, that's the key right there. Where is the evidence? So Darwin gave the idea of natural selection, survival of the fittest. That didn't work. So by the turn of the century, 1900s, Hugo de Vries and others came up with the neo-Darwinian evolution, which incorporated mutations. And they said, first, small mutations over time change the organisms. And then they realized that small changes were not enough, small mutations. So they had macro mutations, and that's where Niles Eldredge and others came in, Stephen Jay Gould, with those punctuated equilibriums. For a long time, there's no change, and then all of a sudden there are a lot of mutations, and they change. But yet when we, as Christians, as creationists, ask those scientists, what are beneficial mutations? What beneficial mutations can you give? And they would stare at you and scratch their head and say, well, DDT. You had some organisms that survived DDT and they became stronger. Well, then we realized that that was just for a temporary time, and they really didn't survive better. They were just immune to that for that particular scenario.
But let me put some genetic teeth into your argument
yes,
right there.
Please.
DDT was actually lost. The reason that the insect became resistant to DDT is because it lost a pre-existing genetic regulation, so it actually made more of a particular protein. Okay, that was beneficial to the insect, clearly. See, so we're not going to say there's no such thing as beneficial mutation. It's just a matter of relativity, or it's a matter of relativeness. Okay, to the insect that's being exposed to DDT, that's certainly a beneficial mutation, but it's at the expense of an already existing genetic structure. Where did that existing genetic structure come from that you got rid of to provide the DDT resistance? Well, you can't explain that. That's like I use the analogy of knocking out an interior wall of your house so you have a bigger room, okay, which might be beneficial if you want a bigger room, but that's not how you built the house. You got to explain how that wall was there to begin with. So what I'm challenging evolution is they have to come up with a mechanism to explain how that regulatory system evolved to begin with, not show its demise. See, remember I talked about going down the mountain? So that's an example of coming down the mountain. It was actually even beneficial for the insect, but it's still coming down the mountain. You eliminated a pre-existing genetic system. You haven't climbed the mountain yet. Give me examples of how you climb the mountain. And that's what they have failed to do.
Very good. This is interesting. Dr. Lightner, I want you to give a little bit there. We're going to take a break in about 3 minutes. So can you give us a little bit more of your perspective on this idea that evolution has not given us the answer?
Yeah, I definitely agree with Kevin. We can come up with lots of answers, lots of examples. He's written about many in bacteria where it was an advantage in a particular environment, but something that pre-existed was knocked out. And in animals, there's often the same thing. You basically find that things either get shifted a little bit. You can turn it on more often or not turn it on as often if you're talking about a gene. But a lot of times things get knocked out, and some of the interesting color variety that I studied is from something getting knocked out. So black cattle, for example, you basically have a protein that's produced, supposed to respond to a signaling molecule. Well, it doesn't. It's just switched on all the time, and you get the darker pigment. Or the Irish setter, which has a red thing. That same protein, which is supposed to send the signal to produce the darker pigment, is broken, and it can't produce the darker pigment, and only the lighter red pigment is produced. Interesting variety, but you used to have animals that could produce both dark and light, and now you've destroyed something in the complexity that was originally there. You have interesting variety, but you haven't gone upward. And so even in adaptive changes, it may be adaptive in a particular environment.
Okay.
So
Excellent.
you're specializing.
Excellent. Thank you. We're going to take a break in a moment. So basically, we've been looking at the evolutionary scenario, which is often called molecules to man. Sometimes it's called from goo to you by way of the zoo, as Dwayne Gish used to say. But basically, the idea is that it cannot answer the question. So when we come back, we're going to give evidence for creation. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Don Deal. I'm the Director of Research and Development for Norm Geisler International Ministries. I'm here at ABNSAT's Trinity Channel to let you know of a wonderful new opportunity to join in on an ever-expanding, ever more influential ministry, the ABNSAT's Trinity Channel. ABNSAT is now expanding via the Hotbird satellite to areas to include Europe, Middle East, North Africa. These are areas that desperately need to hear the gospel, desperately need to hear the truth about Islam, about other religions. They need to see the comparisons between a true and accurate comparison between Christianity and the other religions, and Christianity and secularism. You know, there's so much information out there, and so much of it is so bad, so poorly researched. At the Trinity Channel, it's the one place where you can find the truth, where you're not going to get spin on how beautiful all religions are and how all religions lead to the same place. You're not going to hear that. At Trinity Channel, you're going to hear the truth, and you can hear it spoken by world-class speakers from around the whole planet, experts on topics such as science, evolution, Big Bang cosmology, creation, Islam, the cults, traditional Christianity, the history of religions. You're not going to hear that other places. There's no other channel you can hear this sort of information. This is desperately needed, good information, true information that you're not going to get elsewhere. I'm here to ask you to prayerfully consider supporting this ministry. You know, whenever it comes time to support, there's always 3 steps that I recommend to start with. Prayer, prayer, and then prayer. Pray for this ministry, pray for the host, pray for the technicians, pray for the whole network. Pray that God's Word will reach the world, that the gospel will reach parts of the world that have never heard it clearly explained or defended before. This network is dedicated to providing good apologetic training to help spread the gospel. We're here to ask you not only to pray, but to consider financially supporting this ministry, whether it be a one-time gift, a weekly, monthly, an estate gift, whatever it is. We're here today to ask you to prayerfully consider giving and supporting this very important, this vital ministry. The original scholars of the church were called the apologists, and this network has recognized that we're no longer in a Christian nation or a Christian world. We've moved past that. We're in a post-Christian world where so many of the assumptions of Christianity are challenged on a daily basis, where Christians are ridiculed and mocked in the press and by politicians. We're asking you to consider supporting this ministry so that the truth can get out and reach the parts of the world where they've never heard the truth, they've never heard any other religion ever criticized or examined. Please consider giving to this ministry. Thank you, and may God bless you.
ABN and Trinity Channel invites you to watch a special live debate, Imam Ijazi Ahmed versus Dr. Tony Costa. The topic will be,
Was Jesus the Son of God or only the prophet of God?
the debate will be held October 9th, 2015, 7 p.m. Eastern, 12 a.m. Greenwich, and 9 a.m. Australian. Watch us live on ABN and Trinity Channel, or visit our websites trinitychannel.com and abnsat.com. Or for more information, call us at one of the numbers on your screen.
Good evening. Welcome back to the final half hour of our program tonight. We're dealing with the science issue, a very relevant one for us as Christians. Did God create, or did we evolve from lower creatures and ultimately from nothing? But that's not what we're going to talk about. We're not going to deal with the physics. We're dealing with biology tonight. We have two special guests who are helping us. I'm Dr. Daniel Janosik. I teach at Southern Evangelical Seminary, but I also taught at Columbia International University, and I taught biology there for about 20 years. So I've really enjoyed this, this discussion that we've had. And we have Dr. Gene Lightner of Creation Research Society, and we also have Dr. Kevin Anderson, who works with the Creation Research Society as well in a number of different capacities. So we're going to look at the evidence this particular half hour, and we're going to look at the evidence and see how the evidence really fits creation much better than evolution. We talked about evolution not really having a mechanism. Darwin suggested survival of the fittest and the idea of small changes over time. That didn't work. So even by the turn of the century, 1900s, the evolutionists were realizing that slow Darwinian evolution didn't work. They proposed another mechanism of mutations, of genetic changes, and that did not work. So Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould suggested a long period of stasis or no real changes, and then a lot of mutations, because that's what they seemed to see. Whole organisms formed in a very short time in the fossil record, rather than seeing that as perhaps creation of those particular creatures, and they saw it differently. So what we're saying is that today evolutionists, macroevolutionists, do not have a mechanism. We want to see what the evidence would be for creation. So Dr. Lightner, we started with you, and that's worked out pretty well. Can you tell us what areas of design have you studied, and how does this affect how you view creation and evolution?
Okay, with the medical background, I had to take a lot of anatomy and physiology, which I found fascinating. And one of the areas that I've recently researched in depth is how people and animals adjust to a high altitude, like say Quito, Ecuador, or Bamiyan, or someplace that's high. So if I travel over to a place, say Quito, and I go there, all of a sudden, in order to keep from passing out, my body has to change. And initially, I'll breathe faster, and my heart rate will go faster. But you know what? I can't keep that up forever because there's side effects to that. So what happens is my body does those immediate changes, so I don't just pass out from lack of oxygen, and it'll shift things around, so there's subtle, more long-term changes. And if One of us goes to keto and stays there for a couple weeks. Within 2 weeks, your body's producing more red blood cells to carry more oxygen to the tissue. And your body has these natural series of events that it'll go through to be able to adjust to high altitude. If you're there for a longer period of time, you can end up with more adjustments. I have a daughter that lives there, and so when she gets pregnant, her child, while it's in the womb, will develop a little bit differently because there's not as much oxygen, and there will be more blood vessels going to the lungs, for example. And the evidence for that was done in beagles. They looked and they develop differently to adjust to the surroundings. And so just like you've got these short-term changes, you've got longer-term changes, you've got the developmental changes that'll go on in the next generation. And people and animals that have lived a long time, for many generations at high altitude, even have genetic changes. Now, these genetic changes don't somehow make them superhuman beings or super animals, but they're changes that take place so that in that environment, they can cope better. And an example of that would be the people of Tibet, who are in a very high altitude environment, and they have some differences so that they're not as likely to get altitude sickness as, say, you or I would. They have their bodies basically adjusted to fit where they're living. And if you look at that, there's so much complexity, and as you start to study that, we only understand a little bit of it, and it's incredibly complex. You have to have that complexity or things would just die. And so you find that that requires a creator, but not any old creator, not some creator that throws things together, but a creator that understands what the future might hold so that he can create in a way so that we can adapt to things. So you find adaptation on the physiologic level, on the developmental level, and even to a degree on the genetic level. But if it happens on the genetic level, there must be some kind of programming, because it's not going to happen by chance mutations and natural selection. And we do see actually some enzymes within the human body that are made to edit, and they cannot create something new and better because that's not how the design works. But they take an already complex design and they can do some adjusting, limited adjusting, to help with adaptation.
Okay, very helpful. So going back to the earlier question that we dealt with, microevolution versus macroevolution, you're basically saying that God has created each animal type with the ability, many of them, to have the ability to differentiate, to adapt, so that perhaps the polar bear came from a bear that had a darker color fur, but it was able to adapt. God created those abilities within. And so the microevolution was basically something that is an outgrowth or an indication of these creative abilities. Not that animals changed over time to another animal in a great way, in the macroevolution way, but that these adaptive abilities, the reason that we have so many of different varieties. God loves variety. We love variety. But it seems like He built these into our system creatively.
Yeah, he had to design it. He had to design it, or it would never have happened.
So design is the answer there. And creation shows design very well. Dr. Anderson, how would you look at design, and how does that speak to you in regard to creation?
Well, my background, of course, is more in the cell level, particularly protein, DNA. And so when we look actually in the cell, we begin to see, and it's been described as almost a city, or at least a factory, but city might work as well. You've got transportation going on, you've got all kinds of interactions going on between different proteins and other molecules and such, all in a very nice, sophisticated manner. All of this really just screams design. Even Richard Dawkins has admitted that it appears to be design. You know, we're not going to call it design because that obviously would be too creation, but it appears to be designed. Francis Crick of the famous Crick-Watson team that discovered the structure of DNA, he was a very well-known atheist, and so he couldn't accept design either, but he stated one time that we have to keep reminding ourselves that it's not designed, which I find is a very interesting and very unscientific statement, because what you're saying is we've got to keep reminding ourselves that it's not what it would obviously appear to be. I think if I could use an example, a classic example of the incredible God design that he's placed into nature would be the human genome. If we were to use a book as an analogy of the human genome, and let's say it's the book of a 2,000-page book of War and Peace, but if we wrote that 2,000-page book of War and Peace the way that the human genome is written, it would be 20 pages. But it wouldn't be 20 pages of really dinky print. It'd be normal size print, but you would just read it so differently, because what you do is you'd read it left to right, top to bottom, the way you would read any normal book, but then you'd flip it over and read it left, right, top to bottom again, something you can't do with a book. But then what you do is you would fold in like page 3 and page 7 together, and then you'd fold page 4 and page 6 together, and you keep folding these pages in together, and it all continues to read the total story of War and Peace written on these 20 pages. I challenge then, is that a book that any of us would know how to read? And the answer is, of course, no. None of us have the intellectual capability of reading that book. But here's the thing, could we write that book? Well, we can't even read that book, let alone write that book, and yet that book has been written. It's called The Human Genome. And that doesn't come from some natural, somewhat, natural blind process of evolution. That only comes from a designer whose intelligence is so beyond ours, we really can't comprehend it. And that's what's scientific. You wouldn't write a book like that and then claim that that came from some kind of just random mixing of parts. Everybody look at you like that's obviously stupid, which it is. So clearly what you see is you see enormous design in the genome of the human, and that's the only scientific position you can take. All the other positions are just foolishness.
That's true, and it brings up a very good point, because really the information that comes into the system is from outside the system, and it had to come from another source. In other words, I remember speaking at Clemson University one time, and one chemistry professor asked me a question about my view of the second law of thermodynamics, and as he went on, I thought, well, okay, I think I know where he's going, so I went up to the board and I wrote the word teleonomy. And people were probably scratching their heads about that, but I let him finish with his idea of the second law of thermodynamics, which is talking about it going from a higher system to a lower system, and that seems to show that you had to have a great creative design from the beginning because things are falling apart. But his point was that if you had an open system, you would have a continual source of at least new energy for a time. My word teleonomy was talking about a purpose, and a purpose that is outside of just the structure that we have genetically or physically. There's a greater purpose, and that purpose comes from a greater being, such as God. And the key is that in the system itself, and I took the example of a tree. A tree has a great machine that goes through the process of photosynthesis. It takes in carbon dioxide, it takes in water from the roots, and it takes in the sun's energy, and it has a system where it processes that and outgasses oxygen and puts the rest of the carbon-based molecule together to form glucose, which is the basis of life in many ways. And it does that in a very deliberate way, a very systematic way. And that information is found originally on the DNA that codes for the development of that tree with the system of photosynthesis in place. But that information that is on the DNA, as Dr. Anderson was saying, really is from outside the system, which is beyond the system. We can't read it, we can't fully understand it. In fact, Francis Collins, who worked with the Human Genome Project, for a time was saying, well, we don't understand 80–90% of this, and he was calling it junk DNA, which I thought was not a realistic term, because it was far from being junk. He just did not know what it did at that time. And now we're starting to find out more and more. So there's great design that we see in the system. Dr. Lightner, what would you say further about this whole area?
Well, it's hard to expand on that. There is design, and that was one of the things that drew me to science, is the more you study it, the more you find out there's so much more there. It's just never ending. Yeah. And it's interesting that we can look at so many details, and everywhere we look, there's more design. You have the DNA, the actual molecule, and then it's packaged up in certain ways, and which is, I think, a lot of what Kevin was trying to get at. It's packaged in certain ways, and that makes a difference. And there's little tags that can be put on the outside to tell the system when it should be read and when not to read it. And there's just levels and levels and levels and levels of information. And so one of the problems I have is people will make the comment that you can't get new information. And while I believe that's true, we haven't even finished finding out where all the information is. There's just so much there. So it's astounding. It's a lot of fun, though.
Thank you. Dr. Anderson, I love microbiology. That was one of my favorite areas, getting into the cell and just looking at all those fabulous factories. Can you tell us more about some of the design there that you see that just shows that there has to be a creator?
I'd love to. Can I go back for just 10 seconds with your analogy of your word teleonomy? What's interesting about that, and I don't know exactly what you said to the chemist or not, but those letters you wrote on the board do not intrinsically mean what that word means. And you could have asked him what this word means and then say, well, how do you know?
Huh.
Yeah, how do you know? Because we have as you say, information is totally separate from the physical. A physical word, just like a physical protein or a physical nucleic acid in a cell, does not intrinsically have the information that's been imposed to it. In fact, that's been one of the challenges for origin of life people, is to figure out, well, why did the genetic code evolve the way it evolved? Because there's nothing intrinsic within the genetic code that means that ATC has to have any particular meaning to it. And that's the truth. It doesn't. It doesn't have to have that meaning to it. So obviously the informational code on the DNA came about from an outside source, because there's nothing intrinsic about DNA that says it has to code this way. Okay, so just taking off from that then to answer the rest of your question, clearly again in microbiology, one of the things that's fascinating about bacteria is they grow, some bacteria grow very fast. The fastest growing cells on this planet are bacteria by far. In fact, there's one bacterium called Clostridium perfringens that if you put it in the very optimum setting, its favorite temperature, its favorite nutrients, its favorite food, its favorite everything, it will divide every 10 minutes. And what we see with bacteria is that its ability of dividing so fast gives it such incredible power of change. And that's why evolutionists love to study bacteria, because bacteria can change so quickly because they generate so fast. And yet, even in bacteria, we don't see the kind of changes necessary to even explain what they're claiming they see with, for example, human evolution or plant evolution or whale evolution, which don't divide near as fast and don't have near as much capability of genetic change as a bacteria has. And so we see that even bacteria show the limitation of the genetic changes that are going to occur, which is in total contradiction to what you're going to read in the textbooks, what you're going to hear on National Geographic, and what you're obviously going to be told by your chemistry professor at Cornell University.
So basically what you're saying is that through these studies, we have discovered over and over and over again that evolution does not work. We don't have anything that really supports that.
Yeah. When you define evolution as universal common descent, then it does not work, right? It is a dead science.
Okay. And yet it is the main science that is taught in the
That is correct.
high schools, the secular public high schools, colleges, and even a lot of Christian schools. I want to,
Yes,
before we
yes.
end this segment, I want to bring in another area, and that would be the intelligent design movement. Because here we have Christians in the intelligent design movement, Hugh Ross, Stephen Myers of the Discovery Center, Hugh Ross of Reasons to Believe, very bright men who have a little bit different idea. They look at intelligent design, they look at the design of the universe, they see God's hand all over it, but they say that God progressively created over a long period of time. So they will accept the Big Bang, and they will accept the development of the earth, cooling off of the earth, and the creation of, say, the fish in the oceans by God, creation, but a long time ago, 350 million years ago. And slowly, until maybe 43,000, 100,000 years ago, then man was created when it was ready. It was time. How is that different from the creation that you all would be following?
I'd like to point out-
Who do you want?
Let's
Dr.
go.
Lightner?
Kevin, why don't you go ahead and speak first here,
Okay.
and then we'll come to
Okay.
Dr. Lightner.
That's fine. That's fine. Yes, as you pointed out, obviously they have some of the story correct, but we would challenge they don't have all the story correct. One of the big differences between what they would be teaching and what Dr. Lightner and I would teach is that we would say biblically and scientifically consistent with, but biblically we see things being created at the same time. In essence, there was really only just a day or two between the creation of plants and creation of birds and creation of mammals and such, whereas what you call the progressive creationists would say there would be millions of years between the creation of all of those different organisms. And therefore, they accept what would be referred to as the normal geological time scale. That is, that the Jurassic was, 100 million years ago, that the other time periods were 150 million years ago, 200 million years ago, etc. We don't accept that. We don't accept that time frame. We say that everything is measured within thousands of years, not millions and hundreds of millions of years. One of the challenges I have for like Hugh Ross and others with that particular position is that while they reject evolution, they're accepting the geologic timescale that is derived very dominantly and biasedly from evolutionary thinking, evolutionary teaching. And I find that an incredible inconsistency that I'm going to reject evolution, but I'm going to accept the timescale that's a direct product of evolutionary teaching. How do we know the Jurassic was 100 and some million years ago? We know that not based upon radiometric dating or based upon other physical measurements. We know that because that's what the evolutionary scenario needs time-wise in order to account for the life that is supposed to have lived 100 million years ago. That's what it's really based upon. And they claim then radiometric dating and other dating methods come in later on, but the true geologic timescale was developed long before the physical measurements came into play. And it's amazing they haven't changed any because it's really based upon the evolutionary scenario. It's based upon what fossils there are. There's examples where they would date a particular region and they get a date like 100 million years, 200 million years. For example, there was a lake bed in Kenya that they dated 200 million years. But they knew that couldn't be right. How did they know that couldn't be right? Now, they were using the radiometric datings. How'd they know that the 200 million years couldn't be right? Because the lake bed contained fossils of elephants and pigs. And the evolutionary scenario says there were not elephants and pigs 200 million years ago. So we see that the evolutionary scenario of the fossils won over the so-called physical objective measurements such as radiometric dating. And that's in the literature. That's not a creationist made up thing. That's in the literature. It's very easy to document.
Okay. We do have a question from somebody in the audience from the UK who emailed in, so I want to take a moment with just the few minutes that we have left, and then we'll get back to Dr. Lightner on this. The question is this: when God said, let us make man in our image, who else does he mean? So you go back to Genesis 1, 26, 27, where it talks about making man in the image of God. It uses a plural form, let us make man in our image. And since I do the theology as well, let me just briefly talk about that. It's referring to the triune God. And it's interesting, even the very first words of Genesis 1, in the beginning God created, bara bereshit, bara Elohim, bara bereshit, Elohim. God created from nothing. He used the term bara. And yet that term bara is a singular verb, and Elohim is a Hebrew word that means a plural God, at least two or more. So you've got a plural form of God with a singular verb, and yet it's talking about what he created. And then when you further go through the rest of the Bible, Old Testament and especially the New Testament, that further explicates this, then you see that Jesus was involved in the creation as the Son of God. And you also see the Spirit hovering over the waters there in Genesis 1. So the Trinity was there from the beginning. So when it talks about God making man in our image, it's talking about the triune God making man. But the image is not that we are eternal or that we are God-like, but it's talking about the ability to think, to reason, to have life in a limited form, in a three-dimensional world, as you, Ross, would say. So that's what that is about. And we only have a couple minutes left. Dr. Lightner, if you could kind of chime in there and give some, well, why don't you give some last words of why you think that creation is the correct way to view this. Tell me that. Why is creation correct?
You find there's multiple lines of evidence that really fit better from a biblical standpoint. I earlier mentioned mitochondrial DNA. It doesn't work if you want an old time frame. In fact, if you go back historically, you find out that the idea that the earth was very old was an attack on the Bible. They didn't want to believe the Bible, and they made up their own story. That's where it came from. And so if you look at mitochondrial DNA, it fits very well. And having things be millions of years old, you have a problem because genomically things decay and they should be dead. When we find one of our research projects at the Creation Research Society was finding soft tissue in dinosaur bones. Well, we can measure how fast soft tissue decays. Yeah. It shouldn't be there. They cannot be millions of years old. It doesn't make any scientific sense. There's no way that should be. Interestingly, with the Big Bang, there's a number of assumptions, and that's spelled out. But one of the assumptions is that when you extrapolate back, nothing will get in the way of that extrapolation. Well, what could possibly get in the way of an extrapolation? Well, a supernatural creation is one thing that would very clearly get in the way of your extrapolation. So ironically, the Big Bang assumes there was no supernatural creation, among other assumptions. And so it's like, oh, wait a minute. I'm not sure I like that assumption. Yeah. Why should I assume that?
Okay,
but anyhow.
Yeah, thank you. Good word there. And finally, Dr. Anderson, what is the best piece of evidence that you would tell your evolutionary friends to look at?
I don't have enough time for that, but obviously it comes back to what we see with the DNA. They're just the DNA, the genetics, the way the genetics works, the way the mutations work, just simply is not what evolution needs. And that's why I continue to refer to evolution as a dead science, because until you can demonstrate a mechanism of how you're going to achieve what evolution claims to achieve, then you're no better off than the detective trying to claim that the neighbor killed the guy, even though the neighbor was in Tahiti at the time. You are no better off than that. And both of those ideas would be ludicrous, and we have to recognize that evolution has failed to provide what it claims that it needs and what it is supposed to be telling us. It hasn't done that.
So we're really looking at which side supports the evidence best. When we look at the evidence, evolution does not win out. Evolution loses. The side that fits best.
which
Yeah,
is
go ahead.
why they don't want you talking about the problems, because they don't want equal time. They don't want equal opportunity. Because if you start giving equal opportunity to critics of evolution, then evolution really dies quickly. So they got to protect it.
Okay. So, thank you very much, Dr. Anderson and Dr. Lightner. Very enlightening, very helpful. We looked at the whole idea of creation or evolution, and basically it boils down to what fits the evidence best, and creation by far fits that evidence. We see it in the genetic area. We see it in the macro area of just the animals and the characteristics, and the adaptability can only go so far. There are biological limits to that adaptability, and when you go back to the core, the origination of those particular characteristics, it always shows information, and that information has to come from an outside source. That only source can be greater than our three-dimensional world, and that is God. And it shows the verse that David was given, for we are fearfully and wonderfully made. David knew that because he saw God and he believed in God, and he let God determine the way he was going to view science. Science comes from the mind of God, and we can be better scientists if we try to capture that mind by what we do and what we research, and always realizing that God is the one who brought this together. Thank you for listening tonight. Hopefully this was helpful. And from the Trinity Channel here at ABN Satellite TV station, we thank you for listening, and we pray that you would pray for us and pray for the next week and a half of this marathon. Thank you and good night.
Dr. Kevin?
Yes.
Okay, just a second.